Hi, everyone. Welcome to Café IBTTA. I'm Pat Jones. My guest today is Neil Gray. Neil is the Director of Government Affairs for IBTTA, a role he's held since 1993. Neil works to promote a better congressional understanding about the mechanisms and value of toll financing, as well as advocating broader acceptance of innovative financing concepts by the US DOT and state legislatures. Before joining IBTTA, Neil was the Director of Government Relations for what was then called the Highway Users Federation for Safety and Mobility, now the American Highway Users Alliance, a national coalition of highway interests focusing on federal fuel tax policies and other issues. From 1975 through 1987, Neil held positions with the National Asphalt Pavement Association, culminating as the Director of Government Relations. In this position, he represented the highway contractors and equipment suppliers with primary focus on highway funding, energy, and taxation issues, as well as labor relations and disadvantaged business enterprises. Neil received a BS in political science from the University of Maryland. Hey, Neil, welcome to Cafe IBTTA. It's great to have you with us.
Good morning, Pat, and it's great to see you. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Cafe IBTTA, where we drink coffee and talk about things that are interesting, relevant, uplifting, and fun. You might have been expecting to see Bob Poole today. We made a last-minute programming change, and Bob will be with us next Wednesday. In the meantime, you get to hear from one of the most interesting and knowledgeable people in our industry and our association, Neil Gray. We are taking your questions. Use the chat function on your screen to ask questions at any time and set it to all panelists and attendees. We want to get you engaged early. Now, some of you know that Neil is a big Game of Thrones fan. In the chat function, type one word or phrase that describes your feelings about the epic television series Game of Thrones. Please type those responses right now. What do you think? What are your feelings about the Game of Thrones? All right. Confusing, beautiful scenery, loved it. Great, epic, direwolf, like IBTTA? Fell asleep after the first 15 minutes. Sad it ended. Excellent. All right. Well, keep those comments coming in. We'll revisit them in a little while. In the meantime, let's turn to Neil Gray, our guest. So, Neil, you've been involved in government affairs at transportation associations your entire career. The Asphalt Pavement Association, the Highway Users, and now, of course, IBTTA. We at IBTTA are about to relocate our offices. Yes, we've been in this location for 20 years now, and you've been reviewing a lot of old papers and other cool things, some from defunct toll operators and others from agencies that have gone through many changes. Tell us, Neil, what have you discovered in some of these archives of IBTTA? Tell us about what you're discovering about our members and the industry.
Well, I have to say this is my third move, and I've seen us shed paper over the course of many years. And because I'm a bit of a paper hound, because I'm that old school, I have been given the opportunity to preserve some papers over time. And I'm still surprised by some of the things. Part of our efforts to shut down the offices, we're purging through physical paper. And we have enormous stocks of documentation going back to the 50s, 60s. And as I was going through files yesterday, I ran across one, and just for fun, it's the 50th anniversary publication for the GW Bridge in New York. Embedded within it is a lithograph of the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, original. It's like, this has nothing to do with anything, but this sort of stuff is treasure to me, and maybe to some other folks too. I've run into documentation that makes me wonder whether a given agency might even have some of these documents themselves. And I've talked with Wanda about some of these things we might offer back to folks. as we try, we're going to digitize as much paper as we can. And sorry, I have company in the background. The dog agrees. Actually, he's a fan of paper too. But I was going through enormous old files of dues rate calculations, which is an ongoing association issue. Periodically every 5 to 7 years, you have serious efforts.
Neil, please don't tell them what they paid in dues in the 1950s. We don't want to know. We don't want people to know that.
Well, it's just a lot. To me, again, having been through decades of seeing IBTTA work with the membership, enormous amounts of efforts are put into trying to balance a fair, what's fair to the associate members, what's fair to an agency, big agencies, small agencies, and these things are persistent and consistent. So I've certainly seen this in other associations too. It's an ongoing topic.
Neil, let's turn our attention to the Congress of the United States. As you know, IBTTA is not typically asked Congress for funding, but these are very different times. Talk to us a little about the slow building of traction that we've developed with Congress in support of state flexibility and the work we've done to advance our first ever ask for industry relief in these pandemic times. Talk to us a little about that.
Sure, can do. So when I came on board, government relations was actually still in a relatively new position in a very small office. And I spent the bulk of my time concerned about federal intrusion into the tolling space. Historically, toll agencies operate parallel to the existing federal aid system. And that is good and bad. But the toll agencies, the effort has been to explain to the Hill, number one, that toll agencies aren't automatically part of a state DOT or part of the system that they have direct control over. And so at the same time, we're not asking for tolling to become a federal thing, right? We respect the individual agencies' place in the states. And so we have consistently been asking for decades to allow states more flexibility in the application of tolling, especially in this context of the interstate system. So the only existing language in federal law that limits tolling is on existing interstate highways, of which 3,500 miles are already tolled. But that dates back to the 50s. And so the space that we have been cultivating for a long time is, number one, that tolling is not a bad thing. There's lots of folks out there that will demonize tolling. And so we've been working in that space to reassure folks and to reinforce to existing members of Congress and their staffs in particular, right? So staffs are super important to reach out to because they help direct and color and arm a member to be supportive or oppositional. So in the COVID space, for the first time ever, we were seeing other transportation sectors, airports and transit and singularly, getting assistance. And a reasonable question was asked by the members, well, if they're getting it, why can't we? So that led to us generating our first ever ask of Congress for support for the toll industry. Kind of flies in the face of all the effort we've made to show them how self-sufficient and smart a toll operation is. But at the same time, if funding's out there, our folks are hurting every bit as much as anyone else. So we have been engaged with members for months now. We have never been told we're not in play. We've had questions consistently coming back to us to say, you gave us a number back in April. What's that number now? Or if you had to take a haircut on that number because we're trying to keep jobs, people in jobs, as opposed to trying to offset revenue loss, what would that number be? So we are still engaged. And even now we are still in play, which is quite different historically in my experience, for us to be, number one, polite. Sometimes you will get the thank you for your visit, have a good day, and a polite dismissal, but we still have thorny questions coming back to us as to how would you parse this, even in the context of if federal aid was made available. Historically, traditionally, a toll agency doesn't receive federal aid. How would you do that? How would you allocate it so it doesn't go to a state DOT and go to a toll agency? So we're still in play. Regrettably, COVID relief seems to be at an impasse right now, and we're getting into a very difficult political time where things will go dark on the Hill. But we will keep plugging away. We are hopeful, but not overly so. But the simple fact that we're still engaged, I think, is a marked change in the work that we've been able to perform over prior years.
Yeah, I think you're right. The fact that congressional staff are continuing to reach out to us, it is the culmination of a long, ongoing process of our building relationships with staff, and they're having a much better understanding of tolling industry issues than they ever have before. So I think that's a really positive development. My guest today is Neil Gray, the Director of Government Affairs for IBTTA. He's been with us since 1993. We are taking your questions, and I see a couple of questions here that maybe I can handle right off the bat. Hugh Miller asks, have you thought about reduced office space reflecting more work from home? Bingo! Yes, Hugh, we have. In fact, our office lease expires on October 31st. And we will not be moving immediately into new office space. We're going to save some money on rent, and we will probably assume some smaller, much smaller footprint to receive our mail and to do other kinds of things. But yes, Hugh, we are taking advantage of the fact that our lease is coming up and we have learned very well how to work remotely, and we're going to save a lot of money in 2021 in rent. And we have another comment about people's feelings toward Game of Thrones. And I wasn't surprised to see this from Wendy Griffin. Winter is coming. Yes, yes, indeed. Well, Neil, let's go back to tolling industry issues. And please, people, IBTTA members and other viewers, please share your questions in the chat function. Neil, you occasionally get on a soapbox and talk about the role that tolling plays, the asset value of toll facilities. You've argued in many different forums that the single thing that distinguishes a toll operator from everyone else in transportation is that their facilities are generally treated as an asset by virtue of their bonding and debt structures. There's nothing new about this. It's always been the case, but it's quite striking now. Tell us a little bit more about that. How does the pandemic reveal the differences between toll agencies on the one hand and state DOTs and transit systems on the other?
Well, so I have spent my entire working career basically seeking financial aid for transportation services, from the asphalt side, highway user side, through gas taxes. And at the time with IBTTA, it was an easy transition for me to make from the public space of seeking federal gas taxes and federal trust funds to the notion of a pure user fee, which a toll agency genuinely represents. A gas tax is a rough and crude approximation, which is really being highlighted both by the transition to electric, but also 20 years plus of congressional inability to raise federal fuel taxes. And so the space that we find ourselves in right now, the notion of a toll, what is a toll rate? How do you arrive at that? It's a very clear mathematical function. There's a fiduciary responsibility to it. Whereas, and not to knock any legislature or any state DOT, they live off of what a legislature gives them in a given year. Most state DOTs are quite aware that that's not adequate for what they need. They do their best to get the funds, but politics are involved. And so in a certain sense, a free highway, if you will, doesn't have a value to it in any given moment. Somebody can state to you what it costs to build it or what it costs to repair it, but it has no current net value. Whereas a toll agency typically is structured 100% from that context. It has a life cycle to it that's incorporated into it. It's forward looking, it's preservation of facility. And so some of this kind of came to the fore as we're making the case. Admittedly, toll agencies have taken significant, huge revenue losses along with everyone else. But compared to many state DOTs who have seen their tax revenues go through the floor, toll agencies, because they are bonded or managing their bond ratings and managing their business, right? So tolling is a genuine business, and they do have reserves, and it's not because they just had a whim. It's a fiduciary requirement. It's built and baked into the operation of it, compared to the public side, the quote free. We always use air quotes, free highways, right? Um, is they live off of what they are able to derive from the legislatures. And so that's a very uncomfortable space. And you've seen DOTs do huge layoffs of staff. It's going to be very difficult for everyone to come back from. But even as we're making the case for toll revenue loss and recovery, we find ourselves in the space of many agencies have 6-9 months of operating funds in hand. They have a genuine issue, but they are not off the cliff the way some DOTs are. And so we've had to work with that conversation to say, yes, they are smart. Toll operators are smart, not that other folks aren't, but and their business function, that asset notion, would be very nice if they incorporated that in a VMT going forward, or some fundamental aspect to remove politics from it and make it a economical business asset-based approach.
Yeah, I think really good response, Neil. I think the asset nature of a toll facility is something that gets lost a lot in the public debate about how to fund and finance transportation services, and going on a pay-as-you-go basis, as often is the case with state DOTs and transit, doesn't have the same type of resilience that having a steady stream of toll revenues provides. We are taking your questions, and here's one from Rush Wicks. Neil, what do you see for the future of toll authorities with regard to getting involved with cross-pledging to non-toll facility projects? Will it continue? And he cites Act 44 and the Pennsylvania Turnpike as an example. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, this is one of my soapbox issues. What Pat's referring to there is I have a tendency to do occasional lectures at staff because I recognize that I have a very lucky position to be looking at tolling as an industry, whereas most toll operators, your space is yours, and it's typically at a state level or county or whatever, and I have the ability to stand back and look at the industry as it behaves. And over the course of years, we have seen agencies that cross-fund other functions, and it makes perfect sense in many instances. It's the nature of local politics. It's the nature of the business dynamic of a given authority in their given space. So I certainly don't think it's inherently a bad thing. At a broad policy level, yes, it does disturb me a little because I'm a pure sort of pay-as-you-go sort of person. But for certain agencies, funding transit is necessary because they couldn't physically expand their space. Other efforts, and I do have concerns about it, going back even to my prior history of trying to generate funding from a contractor standpoint, going back to my asphalt days, they honestly don't care where the money comes from so long as money's there for lettings. And even in the highway user space, their focus was on state trust funds, dedicated funds, at least let the universe know what funding is available to improve transportation. But what we are getting into now, my concern is with other tax revenues across the board at the state level, the simple fact that a toll entity is an ongoing business and does have revenue makes them super attractive. And to me, that is, well, in a perfect world, that's up to a given agency. I can have an opinion, right? And in a perfect world, I think that's a violation. But in any
Neil, in a perfect world, your opinion would prevail, don't you think?
Well, let the engineers run everything and ship all the politicians someplace else. But
so it's good to hear from our members and viewers that they have furry colleagues sharing their offices as well. Clark Jenkins writes, "My dogs are barking at Neil's dogs barking." Smiley face. Glad I am muted. Yes, Clark, we're glad you're muted as well, but feel free to post your questions in text form. Well, Neil, in addition to getting on your soapbox and lecturing the staff and occasionally others in the industry, I think of you also as sort of the chief morale officer at IBTTA, or if you will, what Alain Estio would call the minister of joy. You're the guy that has the chocolate, uh, individually wrapped chocolate pieces inside a skull in your office, a decorative skull, let's call it. And you're also, really love Halloween. It's sort of your favorite holiday throughout the year. And Kristen, I'm giving you a cue now. We're going to be coming to you. You've never been shy, Neil, about expressing your unbridled joy about all things related to costumes in general and Halloween in particular. So, Kristen, let's look at this video, and Neil, then we'll talk about it.
This is.
There he goes! There he goes! Let's get him!
What? Team Goofball.
Yeah, you chase us.
Here we go. Wow, I like this improv.
Doink. He hit his head. Aw, you okay, little buddy?
Oh.
Resuscitation.
Here, we gotta do resuscitation.
Cheryl, you're missing the best part.
He's starting to deflate.
Deflated.
It comes back.
All right, Neil, tell us what's going on there.
Well, well, in that instance, that was post Halloween, and I had scored one of these inflatable costumes that I lusted after for a long time. And once you're in that, it's, I mean, costuming. I was, actually in a clown club once upon a time, just to offer that up. The ability to, on the one hand, you have to be formal and proper, but on the other hand, plain, right? Halloween for me is a playtime, and dress up's a playtime. And again, we've historically had awesome staff to play with, and yeah, there's a lot of history out there of pranks and or just goofs and various other moments. That was a good one.
That was a good one, and we must say that it doesn't usually happen in the middle of the business day. It's sort of towards the end when people are getting ready to relax and go home, and then Neil appears in you just never know what you're going to see when it's Neil. And Barbara O'Connor says no one does Halloween better. I think that's a fact. Well, Neil, let's come back to tolling and the pandemic. And ladies and gentlemen, we are taking your questions. You think about the pandemic, and a lot of infrastructure operators are thinking about, okay, we want to restore what we had before, but is the ultimate goal in recovery to restore the thing you had, or is it an opportunity to replace it with a better thing? Reflect on that with us, Neil.
Well, and that's sort of a follow-on concept to what we were talking about before, where return to normal is a relative thing, right? So from a congressional standpoint, that would be, can we get a highway bill that gives us the same level of funding that we had last year? That level of funding is not necessarily related to needs or any other hard elements, but a win would be preservation of existing lines of authority, giving states what they're used to, doing the whole donor-donee dance. And the question at this point is, and I was coming to the realization the past couple of weeks too, that even the toll agencies with their reserves, they are consuming reserves. And those reserves will have to be built going forward, right? And okay, so state DOT, again, they'll live off of what they're given by the legislature. They don't have the reserve issue, but so many other businesses in this space too. Transit has a huge hole to climb back out of. And so to me, elements within this, I mean, one answer, say for transit, is give them more money. To me, that's a persistent and ongoing money-losing operation. It's understood, but to me, it's much more highlighted right now that the national system is heavily subsidized. Highways clearly are subsidized, and we've made the case for years too that I mentioned donor donee. Essentially, that's not a non-issue now because the general funds have been used to supplement gas tax revenues for many years now. So in a sense, the free highway system is primed for a change. There is interest on the Hill in going to a national VMT, gives us a mechanism very much like tolling to assess every driver's cost of the use of that asset at that moment. And conceptually, one would want to build in historical, future construction going forward. It's going to be very complicated, but the return to normal, right? I anticipate that we won't see a reauthorization bill this year. We'll see a punt of some sort into next year. So they'll maintain current funding, which is already, using significant federal subsidy to perpetuate that. And there's no discussion really about the nuts and bolts of changing how we pay for our system. And to me, there's a clear opportunity. Can we get there? I think the beauty of the toll industry as a model right now is even if it's not a federal assumption of the function, historically it's worked very well at the state levels. And what better opportunity is there for a state to incorporate tolling more? Because DC arguments are the same, the same arguments are made at the state level. No one wants to raise gas taxes, though, states do it a lot more frequently. I just saw an item this morning, the city of Fairbanks has just imposed a 5-cent gas tax increase. You've got cities out there trying to take care of their space. And historically, we've had inquiries from, Montana and Nebraska and small communities out in the middle of relative nowhere calling IBTTA to say, how would we put a toll in? And so, I mean, the mechanic is out there. People understand it. They understand it may not be politically popular, but compared to not doing anything, this is, there's huge opportunity to put things on a rational basis, I would hope.
Yeah. Neil, there's a couple of questions here that relate to a greater consciousness about the role and the value of tolling. One person asks, what do you see happening, any advancements or changes in tolling and federal funding for transportation as a result of the presidential election? And then another question about expanded awareness and need for transportation funding from the Hill. What do you see there briefly?
Briefly, well, expanded funding from the Hill, probably not, right? Frequently, you see comments or suggestions of an infrastructure package, from the Hill or from the White House. And typically they're talking the huge category of infrastructure, which is water, electric, public sewage, boatways, ports, seaports, and highways are in there too. And so you might see enormous numbers associated with these things, but typically what we've been seeing is basically status quo funding from the federal side. No one's really talking about a significant change in. But my thought, and this goes back to the return to normal notion, that from a congressional standpoint, so long as they can maintain their historical authority and power, that's their goal, right? It's not necessarily to, well, not to knock them, improve things. At the very least, they would hope to maintain it and perpetuate the system that everyone's comfortable with. And so I don't see, when something breaks and you try to reconstruct it, maybe you've improved it in the process. And maybe this is what we're going to see over the next year or two.
I think, Neil, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that in their heart of hearts, they really do want to improve things. I'm going to give them that benefit of the doubt.
No, fair enough. And I didn't mean to knock.
So, Neil, we're just going to pause for a moment while I make a couple of announcements. August 18th, next week, we have a Zoom meetup on hosting public meetings virtually, featuring Logan Hodges from the North Carolina Turnpike Authority, Deanne Heath with the Central Texas Regional Mobility Authority, Kim Polton with HNTB, and Jose Dios with the New Jersey Turnpike. Next week, August 19th, our guest on Cafe IBTTA is Bob Poole, Transportation Director for the Reason Foundation. And Neil, you introduced some concepts here that I think Bob is really going to pick up on, and that is sort of the utility model of paying for transportation, like water and electricity, et cetera. Also on October 19th, we have a virtual meetup. It's Blockchain Part 2, a technology deep dive. We want you to know that the winners of the Toll Excellence Awards have been decided. Head to our website to check out the winning organizations, which will be posted in the next couple of days. On Thursday, September 10th, each award winner will present the details of their winning project. Be sure to register for the annual meeting to watch this session. And speaking of the annual meeting, get fired up September 14 through 16. Let's make this the biggest gathering of toll industry professionals in the history of the world. You can do it, and it's free to IBTTA members, and we're excited about welcoming many new attendees. To learn about all of our events, go to ibtta.org/events for all the details. Hey, Neil, thanks for the conversation today. I've missed our chats around the Black Slab, and this experience really helps. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks to the IBTTA members, all our viewers. Be safe, keep in touch, and we'll see you down the road. Bye, everybody.